The American Combat Outpost Keating, better known as COP Keating, was a US military outpost in the Nurestan Province in Afghanistan in the late 2000s. Located near the town of Kamdesh, COP Keating was attacked in October 2009 when around 300 Taliban launched an assault. The horrific battle led to the deaths of 8 American soldiers and over 150 Taliban. This is the story of the Battle of Kamdesh. Welcome to Wars of the World. From the beginning, COP Keating caused issues for the American troops within its walls. It was overlooked by towering mountains, and the difficult paths surrounding it that had once been used by supply trucks had been abandoned due to a constant threat of ambush. By all accounts, since its construction in 2006, it was considered a poor and problematic base location. COP Keating was initially set up as a base wherein the US troops could aid and build a relationship with Afghan locals in the nearby villages through funded improvement programs. But this idea quickly fizzled out when the military realized that the villagers were unable to prevent the Taliban from journeying through their towns. Before long, the army decided that COP Keating would be abandoned in August 2009. But evacuation plans were postponed because of difficulties securing equipment like heavy lift helicopters and the political tensions between the US and Afghanistan. According to the website for the National Medal of Honor Museum, 2009 was a particularly difficult year for residents of COP Keating. Between January and September of 2009, they were subjected to dozens upon dozens of different attacks by the Taliban, each assault being more intense and violent than the last. By the time of the October attack, approximately 53 US soldiers and 24 Afghan troops remained at the outpost. On October 3rd, around 3 AM, Taliban soldiers ordered local Kamdesh villagers to leave the area. A few hours later, at 6 AM, around 300 Taliban soldiers attacked COP Keating with rocket-propelled grenade launchers, heavy machine guns, and recoilless rifles. The Taliban seemed to have a well-thought-out plan up their sleeves, demonstrating that they had intimate knowledge of the outpost layouts, available weapons, and military procedures. They first targeted the camp's most formidable weapon, a 120mm mortar, as well as the armoured Humvees stationed at the outpost, which were equipped with turreted machine guns. At 3 minutes past 6, a nearby outpost, Observation Post Fritcher, put out a message over the MIRC network, reading that they, as well as Keating, were, quote, in heavy contact. It soon became clear that the Taliban had also launched an assault on OP Fritcher to prevent them from providing support to COP Keating. The soldiers inside the camp had awoken to the gunfire just minutes earlier. After gearing up, they headed out to fight back against the Taliban, but it wasn't long before the US Army started seeing fatalities. Private First Class Kevin Thompson in the 120mm mortar pit was fatally struck in the face by a bullet, while Sergeant Josh Kirk, who'd been preparing an anti-tank rocket, was wounded by shrapnel and killed by a sniper's bullet. Troops stationed around the Humvees struggled to return fire as they were under constant bombardment from the Taliban. One soldier firing from a turreted machine gun attached to a Humvee had an RPG round fired in his direction, knocking the gun from its mount and resulting in his death, while another nearby trooper was injured from gunfire and put out of action. Now that their most powerful weapons had been damaged, it wouldn't be long before the Taliban encroached on the outpost. Just 48 minutes into the battle, the Taliban began breaching the outpost perimeter defenses. The main entrance was the first to go. Patrolled by civilian Afghan security guards, they were soon overwhelmed by Taliban forces. Meanwhile, according to several reports on the assault, members of the Afghan National Army failed to fight back against the Taliban, instead fleeing the scene and leaving the eastern side of the camp unprotected. Once inside the base's perimeter, the Taliban began setting fire to the outpost, burning most of it to the ground. Within the first hour of this breach, US forces, accompanied by several Latvian soldiers who were advisors to the Afghan National Army, had retreated to two buildings that had not been set alight. Making the most of what they had, about 10 unwounded soldiers at this point, the troops began planning how to take back the outpost. The US and Latvian counterattack plan would use two coordinated attacks. Sergeant First Class Jonathan Hill led a small group of men to the eastern side of the camp, where Afghan troops had previously been guarding, while Staff Sergeant Clinton Ramesha took 5 volunteers with him as he headed to the western side of the camp. By this time, backup had been sent the outpost way in the form of several helicopters that were able to attack the Taliban positions in the surrounding mountains. Furthermore, OP Fritcher, the nearest neighbouring outpost, was able to regain some control over their base, and most importantly, this included their mortar pit. Now armed with their most powerful weapon, they began firing upon the attackers, with leadership at Fritcher orchestrating indirect support to aid COP Keating. Now even more confident that their plans could work, Staff Sergeant Ramesha and his men reached the ammunition shed where they stocked up on grenades. Slinking back out, they moved onto the Shura building, where they opened fire on a large group of enemy fighters. Though the team made a little progress, they were largely unable to proceed further due to heavy counterfire. They subsequently turned their attention to targets outside the camp, near the bridge that served as its entrance, and ultimately secured this area after storming the Shura building and reclaiming it. Though the air attacks were helping to drive the Taliban away, the fires they had set off within the compound were growing deadlier as the minutes passed. The wounded US troops were all stationed within a building that hadn't yet been set alight, but a burning tree close to the structure threatened to collapse it. Fortunately, specialist Ty Carter was able to take the tree down with a chainsaw, avoiding disaster and causing the tree to fall on an empty building instead. The camp was now mostly secured, and that afternoon at around 12:30 PM, members of the QRF, or the Quick Reaction Force, arrived by helicopter at OP Fritcher and headed towards COP Keating, dispatching the Taliban forces that they came across as they did so, though the vast majority were already dead, having been taken out by the supporting helicopters earlier in the day. Notably, supporting forces had been slow to reach COP Keating due to a lack of aircraft and the density of the surrounding terrain. Colonel Randy George, the commander of the US troops in the area at the time, noted that the attack was complex and in a difficult area. When news of the assault reached Western media, many noted its similarities to an attack on an American outpost in the village of WotW, less than 20 miles southwest of COP Keating. During that strike, which occurred in July of 2008, around 200 insurgents encroached on the outpost. The New York Times described the assault as, quote, "well coordinated, disciplined and sustained," end quote, which made it different to the usual ambushes and roadside bombs that US soldiers were used to in Afghanistan, and being very similar to that which occurred on October 3rd, 2009 in Kamdesh. News reports note that the 2008 attack was possibly helped along by the fact that WotW locals had a difficult relationship with US soldiers, and were furious at the time because soldiers had killed staff members of a medical clinic in an airstrike just 1 week earlier. This led military leadership to speculate that the locals were much more hospitable to the Taliban as a result. However, Jamaluddin Badar, the governor of Nurestan Province at the time, stated that there had been no civilian airstrikes at the time of the October 2009 assault, with the last taking place at least 10 months earlier. Badar also observed that the Taliban threat in that part of the country had been looming over them for some time, and that if the US troops had pulled out of the area, as they had been planning to do, it would have left his province vulnerable. He noted that teachers, civil servants, and other important community members had been intimidated and were unable to travel to central areas in the province to carry out their work. Quote, "We knew the Taliban was getting stronger every day in eastern Nurestan. We have long shared our concern with the government and foreign forces, but they didn't take it seriously." End quote. Notably, many sources have stated that while there were rumours of a pending attack shortly before October 3rd, 2009, these reports were largely dismissed and cited to be exaggeration. Badar told media outlets that many of the fighters had come from Pakistan, and that a Taliban commander named Dost Muhammad was responsible for leading the assault. Mohammed has been described as the shadow commander of the Taliban in Nurestan. Badar added that 11 Afghan police officers were kidnapped as part of the attack, as well as several ANA soldiers. In February 2010, a US military report about the Battle of Kamdesh made some of COP Keating's shortcomings public, stating that the camp had no tactical or strategic value and was long overdue to be closed. The report also added that its defense measures were lax, despite the fact that it had been attacked 47 times in the 5 months leading up to the October 2009 assault. The report further criticized the fact that the air support took hours to show up, and that the QRF team did not reach the site until 7 PM, 13 hours after the assault began, by which time most of the base had been destroyed and many troops had been injured or killed. Relatives of those killed in action were reportedly told that there was, quote, recommended administrative action for some members of the chain of command to improve command oversight, end quote. Due to privacy reasons, however, further information was not given. The actions that were being taken were unclear, and it was also unknown who the officers were. It would later be revealed that 4 US Army officers, including Captain Melvin Porter, Captain Stoney Portis, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Brown, and Colonel Randy George, all of whom oversaw COP Keating, were reprimanded or admonished for command failures. In a separate statement about the report, the US military added, quote, the investigation concluded that critical intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets which had been supporting COP Keating had been diverted to assist ongoing intense combat operations in other areas, that intelligence assessments had become desensitized to reports of massing enemy formations by previous reports that had been proved false, and needed force protection improvements were not made because of the imminent closure of the outpost. These factors resulted in an attractive target for enemy fighters. End quote. The Battle of Kamdesh saw the deaths of 8 US soldiers, while 27 more were wounded. Furthermore, 8 Afghan soldiers were injured, as were 2 civilian guards. According to reports, around 150 Taliban perished by the end of the fight. The troops at COP Keating, as well as members of the QRF, remained at the outpost for 3 days before evacuating. The following day, on October 7th, a B-1 bomber would eviscerate the camp, destroying it entirely. On October 5th and 6th, coalition troops consisting of US forces and ANA soldiers attempted to locate and dispatch the Taliban forces who were responsible for the assault on COP Keating and OP Fritcher. Several more Afghan soldiers and Taliban were killed during this time. The Battle of Kamdesh was described as the worst single ground assault since the Wanat assault in July of 2008.